The Rock. The mere mention of his name conjures images of blockbuster films, electrifying wrestling matches, and a global icon who seems larger than life in every sense. He was the last person the weary traveler expected to see perched in a luxurious seat just a few feet away. This unexpected reality would shatter the monotony of his day in ways he couldn't yet fathom. For the man in question, an overworked, unassuming figure who never quite found the energy for excitement, this was supposed to be just another draining work trip. He'd cashed in years of reward points for a rare upgrade to first class, hoping to ease his back pain and maybe indulge in a moment of quiet. He wasn't flying off to a tropical vacation or an exotic getaway. It was merely a business conference. Usually, even the word conference felt like a chore, a subdued gathering of professionals exchanging business cards in windowless hotel ballrooms. But for him, it still beat the daily grind of squeezing into economy class with his knees cramped into the seat before him. That morning, he'd stumbled through a predictable routine, snoozing his alarm too many times, forgetting to finish last night's dishes, and rushing out the door with an underwhelming cup of coffee. Traffic was soul-crushing, and he was agitated when he reached the airport. Standing in the security line, he mentally replayed the list of mounting financial worries: rent, car repairs, and that ominous credit card balance. Even boarding the aircraft felt like a minor victory. At least I made it here in one piece, he'd thought. He entered the first-class cabin with a mix of curiosity and guilt. Should he be indulging in what felt like an extravagant treat? Yet, he felt relief seeing the broader seats and plush headrests. He could enjoy comfort without the usual pang of guilt. Settling into his seat, he took a moment to relish the difference. Real glassware for drinks, flight attendants who seemed genuinely unhurried, and the hush of fewer passengers around him. He tried to let go of the tension in his shoulders until he sensed a peculiar buzz in the cabin. Passengers were whispering, their gazes flicking to one seat in particular. At first, the man thought perhaps they'd spotted some well-known CEO or an influencer with 1 million followers. He shrugged it off, too exhausted to care. But when the towering figure stood up to adjust a duffel bag in the overhead bin, there was no mistaking the broad shoulders, the famous tattoo peeking from under a short sleeve, and that magnetic presence. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. A ripple of stunned excitement ran through the cabin. In that instant, the man felt both awed and out of place. He'd spent years catching glimpses of The Rock on TV and in movies, but sharing an intimate space in first class with him felt surreal. A flurry of thoughts rushed through his mind. Should I say hello? Ask for a selfie? Only to be replaced by a more practical fear that any intrusion might be rude. He was hardly someone who sought the spotlight. He usually did everything possible to avoid drawing attention, but fate had other plans. After a short delay, the plane took off, engines roaring as they climbed into the sky. The man tried to calm himself, focusing on the complimentary beverage the flight attendant had handed him. He cradled the glass, attempting to pretend everything was normal. Just breathe. No big deal, he coached himself, stealing a few side glances at his famous neighbor. The Rock had settled in with his phone, occasionally chatting politely with the flight attendants. He appeared at ease and friendly. He was not the larger-than-life star millions adored, but a calm traveler minding his business. That quiet, however, was on the verge of snapping. A series of minor frustrations, from the man's general fatigue to an unexpected nudge from the Rock's movement in the narrow aisle, would soon ignite into a moment of careless hostility. He'd come on board determined to enjoy a rare taste of comfort, never suspecting that stress and chance would converge, leading him to mutter a hasty remark he would regret the second it left his lips. Little did he know that this brief lapse in civility would spiral into a very public reckoning, pushing him to confront not just a celebrity, but also the unsettling truths lurking within his own life. He was the type of man who blended into crowds. Shoulders perpetually slumped from years of working multiple jobs, eyes carrying the heaviness of sleepless nights and ceaseless worry. Growing up in a modest household that struggled to stay afloat, he learned early on that life offered few handouts. Every resource, time, money, energy, had to be stretched to its limit. He juggled part-time work and family obligations in high school, often forgoing social events to help pay the bills. College felt like a distant hope, yet he still enrolled in community courses, surviving on scholarships, late-night shifts, and stubborn determination. His academic record was unimpressive, but he never doubted the value of trying. For him, giving up simply wasn't an option, no matter how bleak things looked. Eventually, he secured a modest position in a mid-level company. Nothing glamorous, but steady enough to keep a roof over his head. He moved into a small apartment furnished with thrift store finds and an old couch he rescued from a curb. His car was an aging sedan with a check engine light that refused to go off. Still, he prided himself on his work ethic and quiet resilience, chalking daily troubles to the reality of adulting. Despite these challenges, he aimed to stay kind. He'd offer $1 or $2 if he encountered a needy stranger. At the grocery store, he chatted politely with the cashier, recalling how he once stood in their shoes, fighting exhaustion and forced smiles. Civility became his silent mantra, a shield against life's hardships. Few, if any, realized how close he sometimes was to the edge, one unexpected financial blow away from disaster. When his employer selected him to attend a conference nationwide, he latched onto the opportunity. Theoretically, it was a chance to network, learn new skills, and secure a better position. Though travel expenses were partially reimbursed, airfare still stretched his budget. Tapping into years' worth of accumulated airline miles, he upgraded to first class, partly out of curiosity, partly to spare his perpetually aching back. On the one hand, he felt a twinge of guilt. Should I be splurging right now? On the other hand, the cost difference was minimal with his points, and he deserved comfort, didn't he? Underneath that decision lay a flicker of optimism. Maybe, he mused, this conference would open a door. He may encounter a mentor or a fresh idea that could help him climb out of his financial rut. He pictured himself handing out business cards, scribbling notes in leadership seminars, and returning home with a renewed sense of direction. The airline upgrade felt like a symbolic nod to that hope, like stepping into a better version of the life he'd been struggling to shape. But lurking behind every bright hope was the shadow of self-doubt. He couldn't forget how often he pinned his aspirations to fleeting opportunities, only to return empty-handed to identical bills and uncertainty. Nonetheless, he packed his carry-on meticulously, double-checking that he had his conference itinerary and a modest suit for the event. When the plane's departure date arrived, he told himself to embrace the experience. If I'm lucky, maybe I'll learn something that changes everything. He never guessed how close to the truth that last thought would be. Indeed, fate had arranged an extraordinary encounter, not what he'd envisioned. And the first test of his character, ironically, would revolve around a moment of weakness rather than strength. Stepping onto that aeroplane, still bleary-eyed and barely awake, he was about to discover how a minor slip in courtesy could detonate into a life-altering chain of events. By the time the man settled into his first-class seat, he could sense the distinct atmosphere that set this cabin apart from the rest of the plane. Everything was softer, quieter, even the hum of conversation felt refined, as though each voice had been discreetly lowered out of respect for the environment. Gone were the cramped rows of the economy and the endless hustle for overhead bin space. In this small pocket of luxury, people sipped drinks from real glassware, and flight attendants offered genuine smiles instead of the harried politeness often seen further back. Despite having a seat that reclined almost flat and enough legroom to stretch, the man found it hard to relax. He wore the same wrinkled dress shirt he'd worn at dawn, and he felt self-conscious among passengers who looked so at ease in their tailored blazers and noise-canceling headsets. A flight progress map displayed their route on the seatback screen, but he barely glanced at it. Instead, his eyes darted around, taking in the details of a world he had only glimpsed in passing. He couldn't help but notice how effortlessly the people around him navigated the space. One gentleman, a silver-haired executive type, tapped away on a laptop, occasionally sipping from a tumbler of whiskey. A middle-aged couple rummaged through posh travel pouches, seemingly used to such amenities. Meanwhile, a young influencer perched 2 seats over, snapping photos of her gourmet-looking snack for social media. Their nonchalance highlighted his unease. He felt like a guest who had accidentally wandered into a private lounge without an invitation. From the corner of his eye, though, he also caught glimpses of a quieter commotion. Passengers would pause mid-stride, eyes widening slightly, before turning their heads toward a seat near his. At first, he assumed it was just the usual flurry of people settling in. Yet the reaction seemed too specific, too charged. It was as if an electric current of curiosity ran through the aisle. Could someone famous be on board? He wondered briefly, but his fatigue kept him from digging deeper. Then, with the plane's boarding nearly complete, he took his first honest look at the towering figure, adjusting a duffel bag in the overhead compartment. The build was unmistakable. The flight attendant's body partially blocked his view. Another moment passed before the man realized, with a jolt, that the rumored someone famous was the global superstar known as The Rock. For an instant, the man's breath caught in his throat. Of all people, he thought, I'm sitting just a few steps away from Dwayne Johnson. As they taxied to the runway, he tried to push aside the surreal feeling of being in such proximity to a legend he'd watched on screen since childhood. He focused on the usual pre-flight announcements, the seatbelt instructions, and the slight bounce of the plane as it lifted off the ground. The soft overhead lights flickered momentarily, then steadied as they ascended through a bank of clouds. The first class remained hushed, though he sensed that hush might be partially fueled by Star's truck awe. Once cruising altitude was reached, the flight attendants began their service. The man accepted a hot towel he wasn't sure how to use without feeling silly. He forced himself to appear calm, fiddling with the seat controls to find a comfortable position. Despite the coziness, his mind was a carousel of thoughts. What do I do if The Rock says hi? Do I ask for an autograph? Pretend I don't know who he is? Social cues in first class felt entirely different than anywhere else, and his usual polite self wasn't sure how to navigate them. He didn't realize that these small worries would soon pale compared to the real crisis about to unfold. For all the man's attempts to remain discreet, an uncharacteristic slip in composure was on the horizon. In that swirl of insecurity, excitement, and underlying stress lay somewhere, the spark igniting their fateful exchange. It was only a matter of time before the carefully maintained bubble of first-class decorum popped, and he would find himself at the center of a moment that would follow him far beyond the confines of this aeroplane cabin. The catalyst arrived with little warning. One of those minor collisions of human space and personal baggage that happen thousands of times daily in crowded places. The Rock pivoted slightly, attempting to stow or retrieve something from the overhead bin. In the narrow aisle, his broad shoulder or elbow, some part of him, unintentionally bumped the seated man's arm. It wasn't a forceful slam, just enough to jostle the man's drink and nearly send it spilling. Before we jump back into the adventure, we've got a tiny favor to ask. Our dream is to reach 500 subscribers, and you can make it happen. Show us some love by hitting that subscribe button, liking this video, and leaving your thoughts in the comments. Enjoying the story? Comment yes. Not your cup of tea? Comment no. Do you have ideas for improvement? Drop a 1, and we'll do our best to level up next time. Thank you so much for your support. Now, let's dive back into the story. Under normal circumstances, the man would have brushed off the inconvenience with an apologetic smile or even said, "No worries." But that morning, everything about him was frayed. His finances, nerves, sleep schedule. The tension that had been simmering all day chose this moment to boil over. In a flash of irritation, He muttered something sharp under his breath. Something like, "Watch it, will you?" His tone clipped and annoyed. If the world had been mute, maybe The Rock wouldn't have noticed. But it wasn't. Silence, however slight, carried his words straight to the superstar's ears. Almost immediately, the man regretted it. A hot flush crept up his neck. He just snapped at one of the most beloved figures in pop culture. Worse yet, he'd done so loudly enough that a few nearby passengers perked up in surprise. "Oh no," he thought, panic set in. "Why did I do that?" The Rock paused, duffel bag in hand, and turned his head with a polite, puzzled expression. He didn't look angry. If anything, he looked curious, trying to decipher whether he'd heard correctly. At that moment, the man realized how massive The Rock was, and not just in physical stature. This was a person whose presence could fill entire stadiums. Yet there he stood, calm, almost gentle in demeanor, confronting the man's rude outburst with quiet grace. Unable to formulate a coherent apology, the man fumbled for words, cheeks burning. Sensing the tension, the flight attendant checked if everything was okay. The Rock, surprisingly, let the moment pass without a scene. He murmured a "sorry about that," then returned to his seat, leaving the man flustered and consumed by guilt. All the man could do was nod stiffly, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. A tense undercurrent rippled through the first-class cabin for the flight. The man felt the weight of his mistake pressing down on him, imagining that every stolen glance from another passenger carried silent judgment. He tried to bury himself in the in-flight magazine. However, the words blurred together, offering no escape from the spiral of regret. Occasionally, he glanced toward The Rock, texting or chatting amiably with the flight attendants. There was no visible anger or animosity, which made the man feel even worse. It's one thing to handle the fallout of an angry confrontation. It's another to grapple with the kindness of someone you've insulted. By the time the plane began its descent, he was mentally exhausted. He considered leaning over to offer an earnest and heartfelt apology. However, every time he mustered the courage, fear tangled his tongue. The man reasoned that he probably didn't want me bothering him again, convincing himself that an apology would only dredge the awkwardness. Yet that decision did nothing to absolve his sense of shame. As they touched down and the seatbelt sign turned off, the man felt a sinking sensation. I might never get another chance to say I'm sorry. Watching The Rock gather his belongings, he cursed his lapse in civility. Little did he know that his momentary flare of temper would reverberate far beyond the confines of that aeroplane. He had, quite unintentionally, set in motion a public spectacle, a viral ripple in the ever-swirling waters of the internet that would force him to confront parts of himself he'd long tried to ignore. Long before the man made it to his hotel, a twinge of unease told him this wouldn't remain a private embarrassment. As passengers disembarked, the energy around him felt charged with speculation. A few people shot him curious looks while others whispered among themselves. He couldn't hear their exact words, but the tone suggested they were discussing that brief confrontation. He couldn't blame them. Even small moments become big news when they involve someone as famous as The Rock. Stepping onto the concourse, his phone buzzed persistently. He pulled it out to find a string of texts from friends and coworkers, all with a similar theme. Were you on a flight with The Rock? Did something happen? His confusion deepened as he scanned social media. A handful of cryptic posts referenced a rude passenger in first class. Some tweets read like eyewitness accounts, though no one had identified him by name. It was enough detail to paint a target on whoever snapped at The Rock. With each new ping, the man's anxiety skyrocketed. He imagined potential ramifications, scorn from strangers, possible backlash at work, even family members calling to ask why he couldn't keep his cool for a single flight. He felt sick to his stomach, replaying the moment he'd let anger get the best of him. The Rock's calm reaction only heightened his shame. The superstar hadn't raised his voice or demanded an apology. Once he reached his hotel, he slumped on the bed, ignoring the suitcase he'd yet to unpack. Opening social media again, he found the story was picking up steam on entertainment blogs that fed off celebrity sightings. The phrases alleged altercation and disrespectful passenger splashed across clickbait headlines. His heart pounded at the possibility of a video surfacing. It only took one stealthy passenger pulling out a phone at the wrong moment to destroy what little anonymity he had left. In his panic, he considered posting a public apology or explanation. But a million what-ifs swarmed his thoughts. What if that brings more attention? What if people think I'm clout chasing? Fear and indecision paralyzed him. He had always prided himself on living quietly, under the radar. Now, ironically, that anonymity felt like both a shield and a liability. If people figured out who he was, how would he face the humiliation? Guilt chewed at him like a relentless parasite. He thought about The Rock's gracious demeanor and how undeserving of rudeness he seemed. He pictured The Rock taking a late-night flight after a long shoot or a charity appearance, just wanting to rest without hassle. The fact that The Rock had brushed off the incident, publicly, at least, only magnified his remorse. That night, sleep evaded him. He stared at the ceiling, considering ways to make amends. He tried to remain focused the next day at the conference, but it was impossible to quell the gnawing distraction. In the halls and at roundtable discussions, his mind lingered on the aftermath of that fleeting moment in first class. Did The Rock remember the encounter, or had he dismissed it entirely? Meanwhile, online chatter persisted, with users dissecting the rumor. Speculation ranged from maybe the guy was having a bad day to people who treat celebrities rudely are the worst. Some even joked that if The Rock had chosen to retaliate, the man would have been flattened. The internet's imagination ran wild. Though he remained nameless online, it felt like a ticking time bomb. All it would take was one person posting a more precise account or a snapshot, and his identity might be revealed. He'd never seen himself as a villain. However, social media had a way of boiling everything down to heroes and villains. Now, he was forced to consider the possibility that, in the eyes of many, he might become the guy who disrespected The Rock. And yet, a sliver of empathy reached him through the noise. A few online voices urged caution, suggesting no one knew the whole story. Some questioned the narrative, noting The Rock's public statements about kindness and understanding. That subtle refrain gave him a tiny measure of hope. Maybe the situation wasn't entirely beyond redemption. If nothing else, it reminded him that behind every sensational headline, there's a complex human story that might be salvageable with honesty and contrition. As the conference continued, the online chatter reached a new pitch. An entertainment gossip site posted a short piece about The Rock's rude encounter at 30,000 feet, claiming an anonymous tipster had overheard a nasty insult. The article was vague but dramatic, hinting that a confrontation nearly broke out. Some Twitter users fueled the flames with memes and jokes about The Rock laying the smackdown, though the details remained murky. Still, the man's heart raced every time he saw a reference to the story. He skimmed comment sections, noticing how many people assumed the worst about this unnamed antagonist. The Rock's fans rallied to his defense, praising his patience and surmising he must have been exhausted. Others tried to guess the passenger's identity. Random names and profile pictures surfaced, none of them his, thankfully. For now, he remained a specter, the rude stranger. But that didn't lessen his dread. Friends and colleagues who had no idea he was the anonymous passenger casually brought up the story during lunch breaks at the conference. Their reactions varied, but most were aligned with public sentiment. What kind of person insults The Rock? They laughed about how ill-advised it would be to anger a man of The Rock's size and stature. Each joke felt like a spotlight shining on the man's guilt, even if they didn't realize they were talking to the culprit himself. Racked with turmoil, he wondered if he should confide in someone, maybe a close friend from the conference or his manager back home. But exposing himself as the person behind the headlines made his stomach churn. Instead, he drafted a private apology on his phone, imagining he might send it directly to The Rock on social media. Draft after draft, he tried to strike the right balance of humility and sincerity. Yet every attempt felt inadequate. How could a few lines of text convey the depth of his regret? Days into the conference, he woke up to discover a direct message in his social media inbox from a colleague who hinted they'd heard rumors he was on that fateful flight. Panic coursed through him, but the message was vague enough that he managed a non-committal response. Still, the close call hammered home that he was teetering on the brink of exposure. Any single slip or misstep could blow this wide open. Adding to his internal conflict was the knowledge that The Rock himself had been silent about the ordeal. No tweets, no interviews referencing it. Either he genuinely didn't care, or he'd chosen not to fuel the story. A glimmer of hope flickered. Maybe the whole thing would fade from public consciousness if the celebrity didn't blow it up. But the man felt undeserving of such leniency. In truth, he wanted to make amends, even if it meant owning up publicly. Ironically, the conference's sessions on leadership and accountability resonated with him more than ever. He heard keynote speakers talk about emotional intelligence, the power of apology, and how to handle crises authentically. Each talk felt like a not-so-subtle nudge from the universe. The man began scribbling down personal notes, reevaluating his stress management strategies. He recognized how deeply his pent-up frustrations had driven him to snap at someone who, by all accounts, had done nothing wrong. As the days passed, the viral favor began to wane. No new evidence emerged, and internet dramas rarely held public attention for long without fresh fuel. The man remained on tenterhooks, but he could see a small path emerging. If he could handle his next steps with humility, he might escape the worst outcomes. More importantly, the entire incident had become a mirror, forcing him to confront how easily negativity had slipped into his life and how kindness, both giving and receiving, could alter the trajectory of a single moment. A breakthrough came when the man received a short, startling message from The Rock's public relations team 2 days after the conference ended. His half-finished apology draft remained unsent, so the ping from an official account caught him off guard. The message was succinct. The Rock had learned of the online chatter and appreciated that the man seemed remorseful. There was no drama, no lecture, just a note acknowledging that everyone has off days in the grand scheme of life. Relief washed over him like a tidal wave. He responded immediately, sincerely apologizing. He explained his stress. He acknowledged how it was no excuse for his rudeness. He didn't expect forgiveness, but wanted The Rock to know he regretted his actions. Hours later came another brief reply, presumably from someone on The Rock's team, though possibly from The Rock himself. It affirmed there were no hard feelings and wished him well. That was it. No condemnation, no further public statements. Even though the viral story still existed online, this private moment of closure dulled any sting it had. He realized how powerful and disarming a little grace could be. With all this fame and influence, The Rock had chosen empathy over retaliation or public shaming. The incident might have sparked a temporary buzz, but it was already losing steam. Knowing there was no lingering grudge allowed the man to breathe freely for the first time since the flight. Returning home, he needed to channel his relief and introspection into positive action. He dove into the notes he'd taken at the conference, particularly about leadership, communication, and emotional resilience. He signed up for a local volunteer program, loading boxes at a food bank on weekends. It wasn't a grand gesture meant for social media. It was something he did quietly, for himself, to nurture the compassion he now realized he'd been lacking. He also began sharing his story, privately, with a few trusted friends and family members. They were surprised, of course, who wouldn't be, but they admired his honesty. He framed it not as a celebrity encounter, but as a lesson in how easily stress can erode our core values and how accountability can help us rebuild them. Far from receiving scorn, he found that people related to the pressures he'd been under. Many had experienced moments where they'd lashed out unexpectedly. It was a reminder that nobody is immune to life's rough edges. Gradually, the memory of that first-class flight took on a new shape in his mind. Instead of replaying the sting of embarrassment, he focused on the moment of forgiveness he'd been granted. The greatest gift of this experience was the motivation to change. He was tired of living on a knife's edge, letting each financial or emotional worry bleed into his interactions with strangers, friends, and family. Whenever he felt stress boiling up, he paused to remember the turmoil he'd faced after that careless remark. His call to action, for himself and those who listened to his story, was simple yet profound. Practice mindful kindness. Stress is inevitable, but so is the choice to handle it constructively. In the rush of modern life, it's easy to treat decency as a luxury rather than a default. Yet, the slightest lapse can have outsized consequences, while even the smallest compassion can spark a positive ripple. In the end, he never became a social media cautionary tale, nor did he become the best friend of a Hollywood megastar. But he did become someone who deeply understood the power of a single moment. In that understanding, he found a path toward living more authentically. By owning and learning from his mistake, he unlocked a sense of personal growth that no business seminar alone could have sparked. If his story has anything to teach, it's that we can all afford to slow down, take a breath, and remember that behind every bump in the aisle, every stressful moment, and every stranger in our path stands a human being deserving of kindness, no matter how famous or ordinary they may be. And if someone like The Rock can extend grace under pressure, maybe the rest of us can too.